think we can get started. I am Betsy Fallman, the Adjunct Curator of American Art at the Phoenix Art Museum, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Michael Grauer, who is knowledgeable of all things Buck, as you will see, on whom he is compiling a catalogue raisonné. Since 2018, he has held the McCasland Chair of Cowboy Culture and Curator of the Cowboy Collection and Western Art at the National Cowboy Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. That's a mouthful. He is an authority on the art, history, and culture of all aspects of the American West. His publication record numbers over 70 publications, and he has curated more than 150 exhibitions. Before moving to Oklahoma between 1987 and 2018, he was Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Art and Western Heritage at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas. Now, I know Canyon, Texas because of George O'Keeffe, who taught there for a while. But please join me in welcoming Michael Grauer to the Phoenix Art Museum. His talk is titled The Life and Art of Herbert Buck Dunton.
First of all, you ladies have to forgive me for wearing my hat in the house, but I can't talk about Buck Dunton unless I'm wearing a proper Dunton hat. So you'll excuse me for my rudeness, but it's good to see if you've got proper hats in the audience. Thank y'all for coming out on a church night. I appreciate that as well. That's appropriate because I'm a bit of an evangelist where Buck Dunton is concerned. As Betsy said, I'm working on a catalogue raisonné. I've been working on Buck since 1989. And that's a good long while. I've probably seen more Buck Dunton works of art than anybody in the world. Most of which I've experienced personally, and I was telling her right before we started that just this week I've received an email, as I often do, from a collector in Cleveland, Ohio, who found a missing painting that I can now put a location to, and that's always gratifying when we can find one and give it home, at least in the catalogue raisonné. One of these days I'm going to finish that book, but we'll continue to work on the records and so on as I gather more data on Mr. Dunton's works. What I'm going to do today is take you through my own research, as I said before, which started in '89. It really started a few years before that because I was fortunate enough to have an internship followed by a couple of years at what was then called the National Museum of American Art, today known as the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And the assistant to the director was an art historian named Julie Schimmel, who had worked just a few years before that at the Stark Museum of Art in Orange, Texas. How many of y'all have ever been to Orange, Texas before? You got to work real hard to get to Orange, Texas, I guarantee it. It's in the southeast part of the state, nearly due east of Houston, and it houses about 400 Dunton works of art. Now, Dr. Schimmel had done most of the cataloging of that great Western art collection they had there at the Stark. But in '85, she published a biography primarily based on, almost exclusively based on the Stark's collection of Dunton's work. And she told me later that because of the efforts to get that publication under her belt, she was obliged to focus on Dunton, especially because she was on their salary as their director curator at the time. So I encourage you, if you're ever down that way and you want to cross over the river and go get some good Cajun food, you can do that down in that part of Texas, and then make it back way over to Louisiana, come back across the river, and you'll be good to go.
Orange, Texas, sorry?
Orange, Texas, yep. So they have an incredible Western art collection. So 400 Duntons, a few less hundred Joseph Henry Sharps, and it goes right on down the line. The Stark family made their money in lumber and oil, and had a home in Colorado, and often would swing through Taos, New Mexico, on the way up to Colorado and on the way back. And usually the station wagon was full of Taos art when we headed back east. So it is worth the trip. It's an interesting town, but it's very kind of deep south, old south, southeast Texas town. But Julie Schimmel kind of lit the fire about Buck Dunton with me, and that carried through a few years later when I started my own work. And then ultimately, in 1991, I curated a nationally touring retrospective of Dunton's work that really crossed all the way, literally from coast to coast, California to New York, and was at the Out of Georgia Museum and at Panhandle Plains where I used to work. And and so on. So it's been a long while, and it's a Dunton show is long overdue. So I'm so grateful for Betsy and Dr. Komanecki for putting together the exhibition that you have hanging here. My wife and I got to see it just a few minutes ago, and it's spectacular to see those old friends. For decades, in fact, up until about a decade ago, the Stark Museum didn't lend anything. It was against their museum policy, and so the pieces that are in the exhibition upstairs are lent from the Stark Museum, as well as some other incredible loans that I'll talk about in just a minute. But we're really grateful that I can be part of this exhibition, and I'm really honored to be here at the Phoenix Art Museum. I'm going to take you through Dunton's life, and it's something that I love to talk about because he's a really interesting fellow. My wife and I got to visit his hometown of Augusta, Maine, just a couple of years ago to see several of his paintings hanging in the Augusta City Hall. I'll tell you more about that when we get there, but let's get started. He was an adventurous sort and very different from most of the other Taos artists, and was often referred to as the cowboy artist of Taos. As you can see, he was an aviator as well from this photograph. When a barnstormer came through Taos in the late teens, I think 1919 or 1920, Dunton, who was always looking for a new adventure in the outdoors and also proved the fact that he was a man with a bark on, decided to load up in the aeroplane and took off with, as you can see, in the leather suit. I don't think he took the dog with him, but he always had dogs as part of his family, and we'll talk about some of those dogs as we go along. He also really tried to underscore his cowboy chops, as you can see him riding that rank bronc in that photograph on the right. It really all started when he was a little kid growing up in and around Augusta, Maine. His maternal grandfather took he and his brother John on hunting and fishing trips out into the Maine woods, hunting for birds, small game, hunting or fishing for pickerel and other game fish throughout their young growing up. And he almost always had a sketch pad with him. But as you can see, his grandfather's stories about the American West and that mythology about the American West greatly affected him as they were slinking around in their hunting camp built in the backyard. And Two Boys and a Gun is an unpublished manuscript that Dunton created the illustrations for that we had at Panhandle Plains. We secured that from Dunton's son's widow just a few years before I left Canyon. And they're really quite spectacular. I hope someday we can get that published because it's a fascinating tale about how he learned to be an artist. And he started painting in oils as early as 11 years old, which I think you can agree is a pretty accomplished painting for an 11-year-old kid painting this white-tailed buck in a doe, and something that would be with him as an outdoor artist throughout his entire career. Nature drove everything Buck Dunton did throughout his life, not only as an artist, but also how he carried himself and his own personal philosophy in living. He also, and this is near and dear to me because I dreamed of being a taxidermist when I was a little kid. I don't know if you remember the Sports Field magazine. In the back, they had the home taxidermy kit and an ad in the back of the magazine. And I cut one of those out and sent off for that, but it really wasn't much. I think it came back in the mail, maybe a small bottle of formaldehyde and some other things. So there were always skulls and other things hanging out the windows of my boyhood home. So to see a corner of Buck Dunton's den really was something that attracted me because I did the same sort of thing. Some of you may have done that, I don't know. But eventually, he starts taking classes and finds himself at the Cole School in Boston, where he studies with some of that Boston School of American Impressionism, and also with a seascape painting of Andreas M. Anderson, who's really best known for his sailing ship paintings, which would serve Dunton as an illustrator as his life went on. But you can see he could be a little bit of a cut-up, as students often are. And this comes from a photo album that we acquired through the family at Panhandle Plains. There are actually two of them. Virtually none of these photographs have ever been published before. And he moves to Boston at age 16 and works in a men's clothing store while he's also taking classes. And after a couple of years, he goes west for the first time. In 1896, he says he set off with a few things in a bag and a new Winchester, made it all the way to Broken Bow, Nebraska, where I had visited the train depot there. I believe in being in places that I research because I think spirit lives in places. I really do. So the people in the baggage claim office at the Broken Bow, Nebraska train depot thought I was a lunatic when I wanted to walk inside and just walk around touching the walls. But in any case, Buck made his way out west because he'd heard about being a cowboy. And he wanted to be a cowboy, but he learned pretty quickly that he was a terrible cowboy. Couldn't rope a sick chicken with his legs hobbled, or a dill pickle, depending on the quote that you can find. He was not a very good roper. He also realized that cowboys made very bad wages. Between 1885 and 1880 and 1930, the average wage for an American working cowboy was $1 a day. So that's $30 a month. That's not a lot of money. And so he realized this really wasn't going to be the life for him. So he would sketch out part of each year in the West in some place, literally from Oregon to Old Mexico, making sketches in cow camps and also working as a contract meat hunter because he also worked to supply fresh meat for camps. Cowboys didn't always just eat beef cattle. They often ate wild game, whichever a contract hunter could provide for the ranch table. But you can see that he also was called Four Eyes by the cowboys because of his spectacles. And somehow along the way, he acquired the nickname Buck. I'm of the opinion that that was a self-applied nickname. His family called him Bert. Nobody ever called him Herbert, and certainly nobody ever called him William. So the family called him Bert, and I think somehow he needed a better name than Four Eyes to have an Old West credibility. So in the American Magazine of Art, he tells some of these stories in 1924 when he's profiled. In these sketches that he would make out west, he often carried a sketchbook, sometimes with small pieces of paper that you'll see. And invariably, they were in watercolor. As you can see here in this 1905 sketchbook, these are Comanche leggings that he sketched when he was wearing a Comanche dress and so on. These are the type of things that would add to his visual vocabulary as he went west. He also begins illustrating as early as the turn of the century, probably even a little earlier in the mid-1890s, for various sporting magazines. And so this is the type of pen and ink illustration. So he starts working in pen and ink, he's working in watercolor, making sketches, and then starts to experiment with gouache, opaque watercolor, in illustrations like you see here from 1903, from a children's storybook. We had this particular example at Panhandle Plains. This is an illustration that eventually ended up at auction. But he works eventually from pen and ink to watercolor to more substantive compositions in gouache, and then eventually settles in ombre-eye, which was the standard illustration technique until the technology to reproduce in color illustrations like you see here. One's in oil on the left, and one on the right is a gouache, yet again, opaque watercolor. It's hard for us to really grasp when we open a magazine today that they're filled with photographs, beautiful photographs, made by professional photographers. Imagine, if you will, the next time you open a magazine, every single image in it was made by a painter, an illustrator, a commercial artist somewhere who was making these drawings or these paintings that would then be reproduced in these magazines. And eventually color became the technology to reproduce color got more and more sophisticated, and that instead of only in grays like you see here, we can see color better and reproduce color better. So eventually, Dunton becomes acquainted with Western artists like Charlie Russell. I have not yet been able to nail down that he went to Great Falls and met with Russell in person there, but what I do believe is he met with Russell while Dunton was living in New York, where he moves by about 1900. And when Russell first comes to New York in 1903, he meets up with a group of Western artists, or artists who were working in the West, especially Philip Goodwin, who was an artist from New Jersey, who was working in the West. And Goodwin is often credited with helping Russell gain a larger grasp of using color in his painting. So after this 1903 meeting, where he shares Russell shares a studio with a Western illustrator named John Marchand in New York. Edward Berrien is there. Charlie Russell is there, as I mentioned before. Maynard Dixon probably was there. Displaced Westerners who gathered together in New York City to share ideas and talk about the West. And I'm quite convinced that Dunton and Philip Goodwin were there. So Goodwin has a great influence on Dunton's work and vice versa throughout the career. Goodwin was best known for his outdoor paintings, mostly hunters or woodsman in the upper northeast or up in the Canadian Lakes region, but he's often best known for what are called predicament paintings. What would you do when faced with a bear in camp, or when the bear comes around the rock? Do you have the bark on you to react in a way that you don't get mauled by a bear or even killed? This was a common thing, and Russell did this sort of thing too. So both Goodwin and Dunton relied on their depictions of not only cowboys, but especially woodsmen. And you can see in the hunting painting, deer hunting painting on the right by Dunton, and a man blazing a trail with the Goodwin painting on the right. We did an exhibition on Philip Goodwin in 2017 that was at the National Cowboy Museum and also at Panhandle Plains. So I was able to get a little more familiar with his working methods. And Dunton and Goodwin shared compositions, as many of the Western illustrators did, because they're constantly under the gun to meet deadlines for publication. So you can see in the Winchester poster that Goodwin made the oil painting for, Dunton also creates a rather similar composition for the West Undaunted Seeker. In his illustration, it's really one of these chicken or the eggs thing. Which one did which first? But they constantly borrowed from each other. And the standard way that these Western illustrators worked was to go out in the field and make a watercolor sketch, usually about this size, and they would send it in the mails to their publisher, who would either reject it or accept it. They might make some suggestions. Can you do this? Can you do that? So the roughs that you see, they call them roughs, would eventually turn into a finished painting. So Dunton's rough here, it's called Mule Deer, Wyoming, eventually ends up as a finished oil painting for Brown and Bigelow calendar. And this used to be owned by the family that had Jolly Rancher candies, and this ended up in the Denver Art Museum and then was sold at auction a few years ago. But you'll notice if we go back, one of the changes that took place is the horse was eliminated from the final version. But the interesting thing is Dunton painted the horse into the oil painting, so if you look at it closely, you can see its forelegs starting to come through as pentimenti in the painting. So changes often would occur with these as they move towards publication in color. He also was a rather prolific sporting writer, and he wrote about rifles, about firearms, and especially about hunting, which would circle back to his later career. We'll get to that in just a minute. So he's working in the outdoor realm as a Western illustrator, but also as a writer. He did hunting series. This is one example here. Tracking the bears, you can see the hunter down here. Tracking the grizzly, and the grizzly is critical to Dunton's biography. And eventually, the great moment of truth, you see the blood and the snow here, the wounded grizzly coming around the rock. A great predicament painting. Found this one in Wisconsin. And all the man could talk about was he got the axe correctly that's in the belt. This means something to those who acquire this type of work, and Dunton literally knew of what he painted from having done it himself. He was painting magazine covers, certainly by 1905 and 1906, as you can see with Muncie here on the left, and Literary Digest a little bit later. You can see the type of work that he was doing. Usually a lone rider posed on a hill or with a fairly light background, and you'll see that yet again here in just a few minutes. He also did a great number of paintings for calendar or promotional art. The Fairy Seed Company, this illustration appeared as a calendar, but also would decorate packaging. So if you bought Fairy Seeds, you'd see an original Buck Dunton painting reproduced on the cover of that. And this just turned up at auction just a few years ago. Many of the Western illustrations were not terribly well respected by the publishers. Once they were done with it, they might throw it in the warehouse. And so we know with Scribner's and Harper's and others, many of these original works of art were trashed, literally through neglect and poor care. One of the areas that Dunton really focused on, somewhat uniquely, was to depict Hispanic cowboys or vaqueros in a meaningful and substantive way. These are two examples, one in popular magazines, you can see on the left, and then the Cavalier on the right. And Dunton, having witnessed Mexican vaqueros during his own cowboying days from 96 to 1911, he also had the opportunity to visit the Hearst-owned Babacora Ranch in Chihuahua in 1909 and 1910, doing sketches for what eventually would be a major publication using his paintings as illustrations, and we'll get to that in just a second. But he also not only depicted working vaqueros, but also focused on the charo, and the charo as, of course, the beginnings of what we today know as American rodeo. So, an important point here, and I have to wear my cowboy historian hat for just a second. It's important to remember that chaleada were being performed in Mexico as early as the 1530s. That's a full 300 years before they're performed in the United States. So we need to keep that in mind as we go forward. So Dunton was familiar with artists who had focused on the California vaquero, for example, like James Walker in the 1870s, but he was most familiar with Frederick Remington. I find no evidence that he and Remington ever met, but being in New York when Remington really came into his own, remember Remington dies quite young at 48 years old in 1909, but from 1905 till his death in 1909, he has a series of exhibitions in New York, and Dunton could not have missed any of this work, and especially his illustrations in Harper's or Scribner's, mostly in many respects focusing on Mexican vaqueros or California vaqueros, as you see here. So Dunton was greatly influenced by Remington throughout his life, but especially when he went to Babacora Ranch as Remington had about 10 years before Dunton got there in 1909. So you can see these two illustrations, oftentimes a working sketch that would be turned into a finished painting, or a herding scene, as you can see here, more rough sketches you can see both in watercolor here and another one here. These are both in the Stark collection. And I'm very proud to say that one of my goals when I got to the National Cowboy Museum in 2018, something that really sort of baffled me because the Cowboy Museum has a stellar Taos art collection. The National Cowboy Museum doesn't have the cowboy artists of Taos represented in its collection. I thought that was wrong, and so fortunately the board got behind the purchase of what may be the most important cowboy painting we have in the museum's collection, in my opinion, and that shows two Mexican vaqueros on the Babacora Ranch in Chihuahua roping grizzly bears. It underscores what Charlie Russell always said, that loops and swift horses are surer than lead. Notice that neither of these vaqueros are armed. They have no firearms, because everyone knew on the range, you shoot a grizzly, all you're going to do is make him mad. And so the swiftest thing to do was to rope them. You can see that one's about to heal the bear on the left, the other one already has healed the bear, and they're going to drag him to death. Because that's simply the most efficient way to take care of this apex predator. But the museum now owns this. It was part of that spread that was in Scribner's magazine in 1912. This was the centerfold. In other words, Dunton learned from his mentor Remington that to reproduce his work in color in a major magazine got you a lot of attention. As you can see, this is quite a painting. It's quite spectacular. He continued to paint Mexican vaqueros. I can only show you a handful of them today. Here's another in Brazil, because he continued to work back and forth between color and Brazil, as you can see here. This is now in a private collection. But the Mexican vaquero is critical to Dunton's work as in depicting cowboy life. Even after he moves to Taos, New Mexico in 1915, he continues to paint New Mexican vaqueros, you can see. And this is a working sketch for a painting that he never completed. It's 8 by 8. Imagine had he finished it, and you'll see what it could have become with the images I'm fixing to show you. So, yes, of course, he painted cowboys, bronc busters, as you can see, scouts on a trail herd, as you can see here. But he was also very much a victim of the Wild West mythology that cowboys, every time they came to town, they painted the town red, or they came through the ride firing their pistols into the air. Again, I can't help but tell you, as a cowboy historian, this is all a bunch of nonsense. Most cowboys were not armed, and it was against the law in Texas to open carry a firearm after 1871. In other words, you'd get arrested. Likewise, every single Kansas cow town had laws against carrying of firearms. You would get arrested. I know I just ruined every Western for you, but Dunton was very much a victim of that too. Ironically, eventually what happens is that cowboys started to believe their own mythology. So you can see this quotation. They started reading in popular magazines, dime novels, etc., that they were supposed to carry a gun. Well, they better had if they were really going to be a man. It's a bunch of nonsense. Now, just for full disclosure, I own firearms, I'm a hunter, use them for personal safety, etc., but they don't belong on the back of a horse. They just get in your way and they're dangerous. So, put that all out of your mind. I'm sorry I ruined the Western for you. I won't tell you about whiskey and women either, because that's also So Dunton made his living creating outdoor wildlife illustrations as well as depictions of cowboys. As you can see, a great comparison, which one of Philip Goodwin's greatest paintings we have at the Hall, compared to, as yet located, I'm not sure where this painting lives. I hope someday I can find it. But you can see that whole idea of the cowboy lounging while looking over her becomes a standard acceptable thing. With the publication of the Virginian in 1902, this whole idea of cowboy as a fictional character is something that becomes codified in the American and world imagination. Interestingly enough, the very next year, Andy Adams publishes The Laws of a Cowboy, because he realized, and as many others did on the range, that the Virginian was a cowboy without any cows. So if you think about Rawhide, the never-ending trail drive, they never arrived at the trail end. So remember, this is fiction. Unfortunately, the Virginian becomes the template for every single Western, especially cowboy movies made. They're just a variation on the theme because Owen Wister gave the cowboy two things: a gun and a girlfriend. That's all you needed for Hollywood to make the movies it makes. But Dunton also was able to capitalize on this literal tidal wave or tsunami of interest in the American West that swept the world through popular fiction, like Keith of the Border by Randall Parrish, as you can see, for which he painted the frontispiece. He also had competition in this, and I wouldn't put Philip Goodwin in there with the competition, but I would see it at N.C. Wyeth. One time I was on a panel where I spoke about Dunton, followed by the N.C. Wyeth, a person who'd been working on Wyeth for a number of years, and I happened to say that unlike Dunton's friend, or not friend necessarily, Dunton's colleague in the Western illustration world, Dunton worked in the cow country for 11 years, whereas N.C. Wyeth went to Colorado and worked as a cowboy for 9 days and made very accurate Western illustrations, as you can see, because he dressed up all the Wyeth kids in Western clothing in and around Brandywine, Pennsylvania. So that's, the old West town of Brandywine. So if you look, for example, in comparison, how they borrowed from each other, it happened all the time, as I mentioned before, with Philip Goodwin. So in The Pursuers by Dunton on the left and The Little Posse on the right, you can see they often go together, but here's the difference. Dunton lent grit and authenticity to his illustrations, whereas there was often something sinister with an N.C. Wyeth illustration. He needed to stick to Treasure Island and Robinson Crusoe, in my opinion. I'm just kidding. But in any case, Dunton, of all the Taos artists, is cursed with the mere illustrator tag more than any of them. That's not to say that he did illustration longer than the rest. He didn't. All of them did illustrations, and quite frankly, any American artist of any reputation, even the esteemed Georgia O'Keeffe, did commercial art at one time or another in their careers. You have to eat. You have to put beans on the table. So many of them did. Thomas Moran did commercial art for many years. It's important to remember that only later did art historians apply the curse of the illustrator to these artists who were literally slopping paint for a different kind of patron. So if you look very closely at the heavy impasto here and the painterliness in this particular composition, this is some beautiful painting that's going on, especially in the horse's head and his ability to thrust the horse's muzzle completely beyond the picture plane into outer space, which is something that would serve him well later on in his work. And the fact that he could paint movement better than the others and lend authenticity. I really want you to think about that idea. Was he just a mere illustrator? Of course he participated in the old saws about the West. When the tenderfoot came to town, he put him on the rankest bronc you could find. That did happen, of course, but shooting and making the tenderfoot dance, that's a bunch of nonsense. Nobody ever did that. No cowboy ever shot a plug hat off anybody's head in Dodge City. That's not really true. But one of the things that sets Dunton apart, and Dr. Fallman has written about this in her catalog essay, is Dunton's approach to Western women. This is probably my favorite Dunton painting of a Western woman, because if you look, she's riding a side saddle at full gallop and still depositing the mail in the proper receptacle. In 1906, when this is painted, women simply, it was unthinkable for a woman to ride a horse astride. It's only later with the New Woman movement that Dr. Fallman talks about upstairs in the installation that we start to see women riding astride, and there become a whole line of saddles called ladies astride models. Up to this point, a woman rode a pleasure riding side saddle, never above a trot. So to deliver mail at full gallop, as you can see, this is quite a feat, and Dunton didn't shy away from these types of depictions. Whether that meant lady bronc riders, as you can see, delivering the mail not at full gallop, but certainly in a blizzard, which his own wife Nellie did, going to town for supplies and making her way back to the ranch house about 1901, a year after they were married. But he also was very much part of that, I don't know really how to describe it, a sort of a Gibson girl, cowgirl look to many of his depictions. These two here are more than likely depictions of his sister-in-law, Ada Hartley, who came to visit in Taos, but he also had known her in Maine because the Hartley family were very much part of that Augusta circle. Romodita, who we'll see again, this used to be in a private collection in Santa Fe, but I've not been able to locate it recently. But we'll circle back to Romodita here in a minute. Also, one of my favorites here, this illustration that's also in the private collection, talks about how women had to step up in the ranch country, oftentimes because men would ride away and never come back. I did an exhibition called Madonnas of the Prairie, Depictions of Women in the American West, and this was one of the signal images in that exhibition because women continue to step up in these consequences when they had to do the work that needed to be done, and no men were around to do it. By 1906, Dunton is living a comfortable life in Ridgewood, New Jersey. So this is the Dunton home, as you can see here. This is the barn and studio where he could house his horses and also set up his models for different Western scenes. Sadly, this is his son Donald, who did not survive too much longer after this picture was taken. This is his daughter Vivian. Ivan and his son Ivan would survive to adulthood, and we'll circle back to them again. But he's living a comfortable life. There's the barn and studio and him hanging out in the horse corral. So he's really doing well by 1906. And he starts studying at the Art Students League along about this time, but at the same time, he's also receiving commissions where he starts to emulate Frederick Remington, like you see here in The Outlier by Frederick Remington and Crow Outlier that appeared on the cover of Literary Digest now lives, the original does, a 16 by 12 at the Gilcrease Museum. He emulates the first lesson in his first lesson in the cover of Popular Magazine that I showed you before. Buffalo Runners, two different versions, Remington on the left and Dunton on the right. Learning from the old master is what's going on here. We shouldn't say that Remington or Dunton was copying anything. He was simply learning from the old master. Even borrowing from bronze sculptures in this wonderful painting that you have here at the Phoenix Art Museum, and descending a snowy slope by a mountain man, borrowing heavily from Remington's mountain man sculpture, and something he also did in borrowing from an Indian trapper, now named Carter by Frederick Remington, to Dunton's own breed trapper, now part of the Albuquerque Museum collection. So he's looking to Remington throughout his career, even in the military paintings that he did. Sometimes even flipping the perspective, so we're not behind the horses held by the back trooper, we're actually looking back at that horses held by the back trooper there in the background, flipping things on their ear. When Remington dies in 1909, he leaves unfinished a commission from Cosmopolitan magazine just a little caveat here, Cosmo was very different in 1911. There was nary a Kardashian to find anywhere on the cover, and they didn't talk about anything in anybody's bedroom, okay, so just put that aside. It was a frontline popular illustrated magazine. They had decided to serialize the life of General Nelson Miles, and Remington was due to do the illustrations. He had illustrated in the late 90s the autobiography of Miles, but he was asked to do them again in 1910 and 11, but didn't survive. But Dunton was chosen to do these illustrations. A couple of examples. This is an example. This is Miles and Custer hunting buffalo outside Fort Hays or Fort Dodge up in Kansas. The return to the reservation, as you can see here. However, interestingly enough, in flipping things on its ear, this painting appeared in Capturing Western Legends, an exhibition sponsored by the Glenbow Museum up in Calgary that toured the United States in about 2004 and 5, which we had at Panama Plain. But it turns out that one of their prized paintings, as you can see signed Frederick Remington here, turns out to not be by Frederick Remington, but in fact is by Herbert Dunton. Someone actually erased the bush or whatever here in the foreground, or painted over it, scrubbed it out, and then added Remington's spurious signature in the lower right corner. This was only discovered under the examination from a paintings conservator, and it allowed for an exhibition section in the show to talk about fakes and how much Remington can be faked. However, during and not long after Remington passes, Dunton is named as the only true successor of this Old West master, as you can see by the Kansas City Star and other local magazines, American Art News and so on, who also say that Dunton is the only successor. As I said before, he was taking classes at the Art Students League under Ernest Blumenschein, and he said, and Dunton was getting really bogged down under the grind of commercial illustration, so he visits Taos, New Mexico in 1912. These are two of the sketches that he made on that very first trip, two plein air paintings. And remember, Dunton up to this point had not been much of a plein air painter. Working sketches in watercolor that would be taken back and turned into larger compositions in the studio, whereas when he gets to Taos in 1912, he paints different light on different surfaces and in different materials, and becomes a full-blown plein air painter. But he also recognizes that the background of Taos is perfectly suited for Old West paintings, regardless of where you are, even in Old Mexico. So he saw Taos as a place for possibilities. Now, of course, surely this cowboy painter is only going to do cowboy paintings when he gets out there. Lo and behold, believe it or not, a large body of his initial work in Taos, between about 1915 and about 1921, focuses on Native American models. But he also ensured that the popular culture magazines and press would recognize that he was an avant-garde painter. He was a plein air impressionist. Made sure that they happened, and they could see that he would set out with a string of ponies and models and go out and paint in all kinds of inclement weather. Here he is painting Ada. This is his sister-in-law Ada for the rancher's daughter as an as yet unlocated painting. Would you love to find that somewhere? Quite spectacular. About 1915 or so. But his plein air sketches are really spectacular. This little 8x10 that he painted on the Taos Plaza, you can see how luscious that paint is, that he's really slopping it around. This is no longer the mere illustrator. He's gone well beyond what he'd done before. So his lone writers also include Native American sitters, as you can see. Usually perched on a hill, invariably it's a lone writer, but occasionally a group. But you can see, like Winter Camp of the Sioux, which appeared in the second Taos Society of Artists exhibition, we'll circle back to the TSA here in just a second, in 1916. Whereas the real Indian painters in Taos, like Couse-Sharp, where does that leave them? Aren't they the only ones who were qualified to do Native American models and paintings of Native Americans in the Taos Art Colony? It turns out it's not so. Buck Dunton was doing them too. But this has not been published about his work, this body of work. So you can see not only was he painting them on plein air, but also formal portraits of Native American models from the Taos Pueblo. And of course he did paint lone riders who were cowboys, to be sure. and that's important to remember. Usually these are a fairly small size, usually no more than 20 by 16, and invariably they're a vertical canvas, invariably. However, this, not composition necessarily, but the design of his paintings, and especially juxtaposing a dark figure against a white hot background, is something that Professor William H. Gertz, one of the leading art historians on American Impressionism, calls the glare aesthetic, which is making it almost impossible to look at one of these brightly lit landscapes with a horizontal band of skies, you can see here, in this great Winslow Homer painting, with a dark figure almost silhouetted against it, like you see in the Dunton painting Crows. Something that, a device that Dunton used, a strategy Dunton used over and over. And especially in Buffalo Signal, owned by the Dexter Shoe Company up in Maine. It's quite spectacular and it's large. It's a heck of a painting, as you can see, with the glare aesthetic, very much part of that American Impressionist playbook. In 1915, Buck Dunton gets together with 5 other artists and founds the Taos Society of Artists. As you can see by who's on the screen here: Ernest Blumenschein, Irving Cowsburg, Phillips Dunton, Oscar Burninghouse, and Josephine Sharp here in the foreground. They get together to plan a series of exhibitions and to educate people about the American Southwest. Dunton arrives in 1912 and subsequently goes back and forth until he moves there permanently in 1915. He maintains the home in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Nellie and the children would continue to live there until they divorced in about 1920. But he would go back and visit back and forth, but he bought property, and that property today, ironically, is called the Blumenschein House and Studio, with no acknowledgement of Buck Dunton. This is his original studio. When you walk through this gate, take that sidewalk, that's what you see. That used to be a storehouse until just a few years ago, and they cleaned it out and finally acknowledged that Buck Dunton was part of this compound. So this is the interior of the studio with the enemy's horses on the easel right here, painting that's at the Smithsonian American Art Museum now. So all of it's still there. You can visit this today. And he lived there until about 1922 when he moved to La Loma, which is a little west of Taos Plaza. La Loma means little hill or hill. And this is the studio as it looked about 1922 when he bought it, and that's the way it looks today. It's owned by a California family who have used it intermittently as a bed and breakfast or an Airbnb. Not sure where it stands now, but I'm fortunate enough that I did get inside it a couple of times. And some of his paintings were based on like you see here in this particular painting, Bronx Twister was painted just outside in a little plaza, in this plaza area here, right next to the garage. You see there's a garage right there. But so Dunton used this as his base of operations for the next 14 years. In about 1918, Leon Gaspar, the Russian immigrant who fought in World War I, came to New Mexico to recover from World War I injuries and wounds. He came to New Mexico and became fast friends with Buck Dunton, largely because Buck Dunton showed him where to fish, or the best fishing holes were. So in exchange for being a fishing guide, Leon Gaspar provided critiques for Dunton's work and also encouraged him to use the brush stroke as an emotive tool. So what we see in Dunton's work from the early 20s, especially in paintings like Lilly Big Game Hunter, a commissioned painting of a very famous big game hunter, Ben Lilly. J. Frank Dobie wrote a great biography of him. A legendary hunter who always had his pack of hounds with him. Someone Dunton could really connect with. But he started to lays in these brush strokes, very much like what I call little chiclets. And so if you look at some of these paintings, and especially if you go upstairs and see My Children from 1922, a spectacular painting, and I'm so glad it's in the exhibition. This is such a powerful painting, and I don't have time to go into its interpretation. But remember, this is painted just after the parents divorced. So there's all kinds of iconography involving being surrounded and trapped in the sagebrush with no way out. But it's also important to see how Dunton began to construct his paintings by the early 20s, nearly always following a circular pattern that would never allow you out of the painting. See how the horse's tail swishes back over to the reins, up to the tilted head, to the tips of the ears, and about back this way. Something he talks about in a letter to his friend H.D. Bugbee, a painter in Texas. The kids would visit him every summer, and all they did was hunt, fish, and camp. So here he is with Vivian, about to set out into the San Luis Cristos. Here's Vivian with a couple of the hounds. He always had hunting dogs in and around the house, and a whole menagerie of paintings, or a menagerie of pets. But as Vivian started to age, she starts to get that teenage angst look, never a bit more evident than in Vivian on Pet. Pet is the name of this old white horse that was around Dunton very much of his time in Taos. This is now at the Anschutz Museum up in Denver, and I encourage you to go see it. I looked for that forever, and then finally the Anschutz acquired it. It's spectacular, spectacular painting. But as you can see, that emotive brushstroke and his style begins to evolve. He also camped a lot with Ivan, who was a couple years younger than Vivian. As you can see, they did a good deal of bird hunting, and also a good deal of fishing, where Ivan would pose for him as boy fishing here, and June in the Canyon, which is a spectacular 16 by 20 in Dunton's oeuvre. Dunton had given up illustration completely when he left New York to move to Taos in 1950. However, it was a struggle financially, and so when Harper's approached him to do a whole new set of illustrations for a new edition of Riders of the Purple Sage, I don't know if it was in his contract or not, but it was advertised with illustrations in color by W. Herbert Dunton, which speaks to his status as a Western illustrator, certainly by the early 20s. And he paints spectacular illustrations. I only show you two of them here. I've found about a half dozen of these illustrations. I haven't found all the originals, but they're really quite something. Very Art Nouveau, very Art Deco in their design, but very much in keeping with the direction that Dunton would go for the rest of his career. He also secured a commission to paint 3 lunettes for the Missouri State Capitol, as did Couse, as did Burning House, as did Burt Phillips. So they all worked on these lunettes, and you can see about the size that they were and put in place. They were about $1,000 a piece, which was welcome money in 1923. But his Impressionism really held strong throughout the 20s, for the most part, except in the illustrations. And you can see that glare aesthetic coming in the dark figures posed against the glaring white background, or sometimes he would flip it on its ear and pose Old Pet against the snow, which is a very modern thing to do. And Dunton is modern. This is something else we'll discuss. In 1918, he befriends a Texas artist named H.D. Bugbee, whom I mentioned before. And interestingly enough, Harold Dow Bugbee wasn't very much of a Western-sounding name, so probably Dunton renamed him Bill, because, of course, he named himself Buck, in my opinion. So Buck and Bill became fast friends, and a furious correspondence, and that correspondence is some of the most revealing things about Dunton's latter life, from the letters he wrote to Bugbee from 1922 until his death in 1936. And I published an article on that if you're interested. It's very revealing about Dunton and the things he went through throughout his life. He also was struggling with his work, but he was continuing to paint and hopefully to make progress, as he said. They've shown constant improvement in my work. Little 8x10s. He produces a number of these that he can sell to people who are visiting his studio throughout his career. But the question is, are they popular? Is he simply painting these for the market? Is he justifying them in his own mind by saying, are they showing constant improvement? This is one of the questions, the conundrums that art historians struggle with all the time. However, he also wanted to ensure that he was seen as a man with a bark on, as I mentioned before. So when he tangles with a rambunctious mayor named Lady in the yard in the plaza on La Loma, as you can see, he's quite proud of him riding her slick. He tore down 3 strands of barbed wire and nearly cut his own leg off thanks to his leggings that he was wearing. And he writes to Bugbee at least 3 different letters retelling this episode, because he wants to ensure that this is cemented. And Bugbee made an illustration of the dogs underneath his feet, very much in Charlie Russell tradition. This is a little 1928 drawing about this big, quite spectacular. But it also, this 1928 accident with this rambunctious mayor, started his physical decline. It starts in 1928, probably due to a hernia he received from this bronchitis episode. He's driving himself to Albuquerque to go to the hospital to get this repaired when he runs into a gunman in Rio Grande Gorge near Embudo Station. The gunman allegedly stops Dunton in his Model T, driving down the gravel road, and Dunton, of course, having his 6-shooter with him, pulls it out and shoots at the guy. He says he wounds him, turns himself into the sheriff in Santa Fe. Everyone goes back, they can find no body, they can find no trail. So the irreverent Spud Johnson in Taos, New Mexico, writes a ballad called Buck Dunton and the Desperado, and publishes a broadside showing Dunton's version of the events, and writes about, in prose, very much tongue-in-cheek about this brave man, this brave cowboy, down through Rio Grande Gorge. It absolutely infuriates Dunton. Writes to the Taos News and says, this is a bunch of nonsense, this really did happen, here's how it went, and so on. So it becomes yet another, the feeling is that he's starting to lose his status as the cowboy artist of Taos in Taos by this time. However, his work undergoes yet another change. I believe from my work, Dunton subscribed and ascribed to the tenets of regionalism that started to hold sway in American art in the United States in the late 1920s. In 1926, and 27, Dunton sent his paintings on tours throughout Texas. The regionalists in Dallas were very strong and very connected to the regionalist movement in the Midwest, especially with Thomas Hart Benton, Grant Wood in Iowa, and John Stuart Curry in Kansas. And they brought Benton to Dallas, and Benton has supported what they were doing in Texas amongst the Texas regionalists. So Dunton, being friends with the Taos artists, was very much connected with what was going on. In particular, the regionalist insistence that all their work was a form of constructing paintings using hard visual data, like not only sketches, but also studies of parts of paintings, as well as large schematics, so they could fill them in. So the construction part, the strategies that were used to build these paintings were things that Dunton used in building paintings like Romoldita. As you can see, she's posed riding a lady's astride saddle here, but in profile, but eventually comes toward us in the finished canvas. And I'm here to admit, I'd never seen this in person until today, and only seen it in reproduction form. It's quite spectacular, and I love your sensitive interpretation on the label. But Romoldita, who I believe was a woman who was a housekeeper named Mrs. Lucero, who worked for Dunton, and I appreciate what you dug up on it, Dr. Baldwin, because that's important to know about who this sitter really was. After he divorced Nellie in 1920, near as I know, he had no romantic interest, but he writes about this a lot to Bugbee, talking about he has no one in his life. So whoever this model is who sits for the Romoldita sketches also sits for Senorita in Black, which is a small painting that never got enlarged into a larger painting, but it's these sketches and studies that help build and construct the hard visual data that would go into Dunton's finest regionalist paintings, such as Pastor de Cabras. And even to a dog named Riley, this is Riley here, by the way, and Dunton always had hounds around that I mentioned before, but Julian Duran, who's the shepherd boy here, had a dog named Riley who was part of the pose. This goat's name is Jimmy Sakatano. Doesn't mean anything, it was just a silly name that Julian gave to him. And I learned this from scholar James Moore, former director of the Albuquerque Museum. This painting in particular caught the eye of none other than the great Texas regionalist Alexander Hogue, who wrote about it in the Southwest Review. And I'm going to read this. I don't normally read slides, but I will read. The quality that makes it seem possible to walk around a painted object. The touches which caused that painted object to appear surrounded by air gave Dunton his strongest claim to greatness. So the subsequent canvases that Dunton paints from Pastor de Cabras to his death in 1936, are constantly informed that ability to surrounded by air. You feel like you can step into the canvases up to a certain point. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I believe that Dunton's regionalist work should be held in the same breath when we talk about the great regionalist painting, like Grant Wood, who told us that in painting paintings like American Gothic, he was giving new life to old fables. So Dunton, having been a hunter throughout his life, when he paints Nathan Dolan, a trapper and hunter in Taos, originally painted him holding an old Winchester in his hand. Dunton painted it out, and if you go upstairs, it's kind of hard in this dark side. The stripe on his trousers, the color originally matched the trousers, but because it was paint laid in over time, as I mentioned before, the pentimenti are coming through. All over paint will darken over time, and that's what's happened. Why did Dunton paint out the rifle? Why did he have to give new life to this old fable when hunting was perfectly agreeable to him? What I believe is his health concerns started to inform his own views of hunting, big game hunting in particular, in and around Taos. And I didn't paint out the coyote skin hanging in Ginger's hand. That's still there, because you can never get rid of coyotes. That would never happen. But why did he paint out the Winchester? Dunton had always been very much part of the Taos Fish and Game Commission. He was even president for a while in the late teens and early 20s. But giving a new life to old fables is something that he did with his cowboy and ranching scenes, especially in Texas of Old, which he painted in 1929, and Texas of Old, Old Texas of Old and Old Texas. I got this reversed. This is Old Texas, this is Texas of Old, and this painting actually lived here in Phoenix up until just a few years ago. Sold at auction. It's quite a thing, but giving new life to old fables through strategies and painting is exactly what Grant Wood was doing. And so when Dunton would make sketches like these, he had in mind his own experiences or the experiences of fellow outdoorsmen or hunters throughout his career. And they would turn into large-scale canvases like Return of the Deer Hunter, about 1930, as you can see. Or Bobcat Hunter, that would start this way and be finished this way by 1930. So those strategies are still in place. Again, hard visual data. Luckless Hunter, as you can see here, two different versions, usually in about a 16 by 20 version, and then blown up into a 20 by 30 or 30 by 40. A Sunset in the Foothills, for example, up in the gallery, has its own companion 16 by 20 I had in my 91 retrospective years ago. Old Pet, as I mentioned before, was very much part of that hard visual data. So we kept these sketches around. It was a visual library, so we could bring it in and see it in its canvas and then transfer it. You know, we call it cut and paste when we do things today. It's very much that sort of attitude that he was doing. And even hound dogs like Rustler, or this hound dog here, both studies in the Stark collection, eventually find their way into sketches for compositional sketches like you see here for McMullen Guide, and finally into his, by far the most theatrical canvas he did. It took him 8 years to complete it, 1926 to 1934. He got more and more theatrical, that ability to paint an object that you can walk around and feel like you get surrounded by air. Eventually, I believe, Dunton codified them into small dioramas on canvas of the Old West, but not an Old West of Buffalo Bill, but the Old West that was somehow new. It's the New West, Dunton's New West. So when J.T. McMullen, who was a longtime cowboy, had nothing else to do but become a dude wrangler and a hunting guide. He couldn't cowboy anymore, but he was still very much a character from the Old West who was somehow trying to find his way in the New West. As did Philosopher of the Hills. And Dunton, as you can see, knew that his time was running out. I'm going to hand down to posterity a bit of an unadulterated real thing, and if it's the last thing I do, and I'm going to do it muy pronto. He knew he was running out of time, and he knew he had to pass on that baton in some way. I believe that as he strayed from what we normally associate with Buck Dunton, paintings that he had outdoorsmen or cowboys or even Native Americans, he was even painting still lifes at the end of his life. Are these memento mori? Are these Bonitas pictures? Is he talking about his imminent death that he knows is coming because his health continued to fail? He also turns to lithography. Initially wanted to do etchings, but he turned to lithography, which had a great renaissance in the 1930s. And he creates Bronco Buster, which I think is his greatest lithograph, and also a series called In the Heart of the Wilderness. And he did bears, he did elk, he did mule deer, as you can see here. And you can relate this to a painting that's upstairs that Dunton did as an oil for the Public Works of Art project. He also did an old-timers series. And he would make Conte or charcoal crayons of old-timers and then turn them into this wonderful, beautiful linear portraits of old-timers in the New West. So it was the New West. And sometimes they were Native American models like cornweeds and brown elk, as you can see here. And nearly all of them had a little biography that Dunton would type and stick to the back of each one. He even had Charles Goodnight come to town in Taos in 1928 on this last trip there. And Goodnight only agreed to sit for Dunton because he was riding with none other than the historian J. Evetts Haley. And he said, there are so many portraits of Goodnight in Texas as there are buzzards, and they're just about as useful. But he agreed to sit with him as Dunton handled him a braided rawhide lariat from Mexico. And so while Goodnight is looking at this braided rope, Dunton's finishing a charcoal drawing. And as Dunton turns the easel so that Charles Goodnight can see it, Goodnight allegedly said, "That's a beautiful piece of work." And when he saw the pleased expression on Dunton's face, he said, "I'm talking about this rope," and walked out of the studio. Goodnight was notoriously cranky. He only made this in charcoal, and he only made an edition unique and another copy. There were only 3 of these. He never made them in the editions of 100 that he normally would make. But First Snow Mule Deer was actually made in 2 different editions, and they flipped for whatever reason. In 1935, he flipped them. But as you can see, both Kenneth Adams and Charles Brenninghouse, Oscar Brenninghouse, both of whom made their own lithographs, were very pleased with this print in particular. Dunton had hunted throughout his life. He had fished throughout his life. He hunted big game and spoke out against big game hunting in New Mexico, especially people who couldn't kill with one shot. He felt you ought to go home and practice until you could. And so he had no sympathy for anyone who wounded an animal in the wild. But as his health just started to deteriorate, he started to go on what he called dry hunts. And he would take a small thumb box panel about this size and make sketches. Whereas before he would shoot an animal, put it in a position and let it freeze overnight and come back and sketch it. After this, he's sketching them in the wild. And so his body of work is filled with sketches of elk and bear and mule deer and so on, as you can see here. And it harkens back to that first sketch he made when he's 11 years old, when he's simply observing nature and not trying to put it as a game animal. So these kinds of sketches turned into some of his finest wildlife work, like October in the Canyon Bottom, in the Tetons on the left, and elk on the right. His last actual hunt was on the Tio Ranch near Raton, New Mexico, and he was hunting pronghorns. And it eventually turned into a lithograph and also an oil painting that lived in Dallas for many, many years before sold at auction. As I mentioned before, he did do work for the Public Works of Art project, one of the 4 New Deal art programs, producing oil paintings for a Fish and Game of New Mexico brochure. And these paintings have been somewhat controversial, and we don't have time to get into that today. But you can see that regionalist approach was something he used to great effect throughout his work. There's a brochure again. Now I'm going to really throw the final curveball at you. As his work progressed, as he refined it, I believe that his field sketches took on more and more of a modernist color field look. As you can see in both these field sketches taken on one of his dry hunts. And this sketch in particular was actually shown, I'm proud to say, at the Vatican in 2002, part of a group of paintings that went to the Vatican through the Art Nemesis program from the U.S. State Department. They selected this because they thought it was a modern painting out of the American West. It's quite spectacular. However, We don't normally think of Dunton as a modernist painter. We think of Victor Higgins, of course. But here's Dunton in comparison. We think of Victor Higgins in this spectacular large canvas, but has it compared here to Dunton, doing very similar things. Even Ernest Blumenschein, we always consider a modernist painting. But what about Dunton in his spectacular portrait of Singing Rain that hangs at the Couse-Sharp Museum at the Fashion House? And even when compared to Oscar Burninghouse, we don't normally consider him a modernist. Look at this. The decorative associations with the painting of cottonwood foliage in fall with these horses down below. As he started to go away, as his health started to fade, animals became more and more important to him. Unfortunately, he had to sell off all his dogs because during the Depression, things hit him very hard. So by the time he passed, his dogs were gone, all his horses were gone. He did have very briefly a coyote pup named Billy. Unfortunately, Billy didn't survive, but he also kept a cat around in this great Will O'Connell photograph of a cat on his lap. But he always loved animals and always had them around. His final great painting to me, even though in its chronology is not late, is October. I think this is autobiographical. I really do. In this quotation, which if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read. A lone wolf? Yes, and human, but I am far from alone. For with me constantly is my art, in which I am absorbed and back in the hills, with a saddle horse and one to pack, and with a hound or two I'm quite content, with the trees and streams and the deer, elk, and bear all about me. And bears in particular were key to him. And as you can see in this great painterliness, rendering that water as it wraps around the horses' feet as they cross the stream is quite spectacular. Even this little riffle that you can see, those little falls right here, spectacular bits of painting throughout it. The great decorative quality of the cottonwoods you can see in the junipers here behind it. Bears had always been really important to him throughout his life. He had hunted them throughout his career all across New Mexico. However, his final canvases focused on bears, and typically a black bear and two cubs. So black bears here made in three different versions, as you can see. I'm showing you two of them here on the screen. 50 by 50 and also 14 by 14 was the smallest one. He tended to do that in the latter part of his career as he worked on them. Even made their way into a picture book, as you can see. So found their way into popular culture. This is a photograph of your installation upstairs with mountain mother, black bear, and cubs that you see here. There's a McMullen guide in Romualdita. But he also made it into a lithograph. Is this autobiographical? Is this Nellie and Ivan and Vivian? We don't know. But he made his lithographs in editions of 100. His final two paintings, 1934, of the Public Works of Art Project, painted this, which hung in the White House while Roosevelt was still president. And Timberline in 1932 at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center up in Cody, Wyoming now. And the difference here, of course, here, the mother black bear with two cubs and a lone grizzly. Is the lone grizzly, Buck Dunton. His final paintings, Crest of the Ridge here, a small canvas about this size, 12 by 16 or so. And his final work here, Crest of the Rockies Grizzly. He sent it off to be printed by George C. Miller in New York, who was his printer, the greatest lithography printer in the country at the time. Dunton died before the proofs came back. So every print in that edition is signed by either his son, or Ivan, or his daughter, Vivian. And this is true generally of any Dunton lithograph after number 50, because he felt as the edition got smaller, the prints became more valuable. So you will see them signed with Dunton's signature, and then below the MAC line you'll say, by either V.E. Dunton or Ivan Dunton, if you see them in the market. But I think it's important to remember that this was his final work. He saw himself as a lone grizzly, looking over to his beloved Sangre de Cristos. Sadly, he died of 3 different types of cancer in 1936, the same year that Taos died and Ufer died. It was a tragedy in Taos, the Taos Art Colony. A Couse-Dunton retrospective was held at the Museum of Fine Arts in Santa Fe. Both these paintings were in that show. This is his grave at Sierra Vista Cemetery out near Taos Pueblo. I visit that grave whenever I'm in Taos. It's just something I feel I have to do. Pull the weeds up and make it a little more presentable because nobody else goes out to do it. But what I've done today, as I mentioned before, the Stark Museum of Art has over 400 Dunton works. They maintain a gallery in their overall Western scope. This is a photograph of the Stark Museum at Orange, Texas, so I encourage you to go see it. Like I mentioned before, Julie Schimmel's 1985 biography, but when I began my research, Julie sent all of her research to me. And she wrote in her letter, I hereby pass the mantle of Dunton expert on to you. That doesn't mean I'm a Dunton expert, but I do have Julie Schimmel's research files. We did the retrospective in '91 that I mentioned before. This is the catalog for that exhibition. If you're interested, I can help you get a copy of that. There are a couple of errors that I would adjust at this point. That was a little while ago. At Panhandle Plains, I'm proud that I helped put together a 52-piece Dunton collection, including personal items. And also very proud that we can now say that the Cowboy Artists of Taos is part of the National Cowboy Museum, along with James Earl Frazier's Into the Trail, and also this Welcome Sundown sculpture that's really quite fantastic out at our front entrance by Hollis Wilford. So, Buck Dunton, adventurer, daredevil, hunter, cowboy, and most important, an American artist. Thank you very much.
That was a good ride. If you had questions, I'm very partial to the bears. I insisted on having a bear in the show just because they're so wonderful. But if you have a few questions, we can handle them up here.
You may not be able to sit. Question, yes.
Yeah,
In your lecture, you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned a number of pieces recently coming to auction.
Yep.
And I'm curious if you would share with us the price ranges on some of the most impressive pieces.
Well, we art historians don't like to get into the market. I will say that he's finally caught up with the other Taos artists, finally, because his work lagged very much behind the rest of them. Coeur d'Alene is the best place to look up for his record was set at Coeur d'Alene, I think 2 years ago, for a great painting called Tree that I didn't show. But yeah, he's certainly catching up. Interestingly though, his grisaille illustrations really lag way behind. And so if you're interested in finding a Dunton for your collection, you can still do pretty well in that realm. I think it's, hold on, I think it's Christie's has a couple coming up this weekend, or they did last weekend, I can't remember. Because I work with all the auction houses and most of the galleries whenever one comes up, so I can add it to the catalog raisonné. Is that a good way to dodge your question?
Dunton has 400 works at the Stark.
Yeah.
How many total Duntons have you cataloged?
How many have I cataloged?
Or how many Duntons do you think there are?
I've cataloged about 780. I think there are at least twice, so at least 800 to 1,000 out there. But he was so prolific as an illustrator, and slop and paint. Grisaille is just a different palette choice, in my opinion. So I treasure the gray, black and white illustrations as well as the other ones. I mean, I do. Of course, I'm not very objective anymore at this point. So, does that answer your question, sir? Okay. Oh, come on. Anyone want to argue with me?
Charlotte.
Great.
Whoop. Okay, you.
What was the brochure controversial?
It was an ownership question about a picker bought them from a gentleman who owned them and unfortunately greatly undervalued them in his purchase price, and then the picker turned around and flipped them for a ton of money, and it ended up in federal court. Yeah. And on that note, I will say this. Remember, anything that was done for the New Deal is federal property. And the easel paintings that were done for the Public Works of Art project remain federal property. So if somebody actually owns one of those, I've seen those come across my desk too. You have to let the federal government know that you know where this is, because it's still federal property. A mural, even though it's in a post office, if you remove it from the wall, it immediately goes back to the federal warehouse in DC. And I've actually seen that happen. So leave it on the wall, don't mess with it. But an easel painting, and there were tons of them in post offices and depots and so on. People took them, and it's actually theft. So if you have one of those, turn it in. Yes, sir.
Did he make many of Zane Gray's illustrations?
Pardon me?
Did they do many of Zane Gray's illustrations?
Do they do? I'm sorry.
Zane Gray's illustrations?
Right. I've tracked down about half of those for the book. Nowhere, most of them are that half are, but I haven't been able to find all of them.
I know that Gray often used Lillian Wilhelm Smith as his illustrator.
Right.
Are you familiar with a connection between the two?
I don't know of any connection per se. That special edition, that 1921 edition of Riders of the Purple Sage, I think was largely to bring Dunton out of retirement, because the following year he did a series of grisaille illustrations for Gray's Wanderer of the Wasteland. So it was an attempt to bring Dunton back into the fold of Western illustration, and that he was done after that, after 22.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Did he do any sculpting?
I've never seen a Dunton sculpture. Never. Never did any leather tooling or anything like that. I never saw anything like that. And he didn't use clay models or wax models like Charlie Russell did or anything like that. I've never seen it, which is kind of interesting. Anybody else? Much obliged for letting me come and visit with you a little bit.